and Council opposed changes to the flight control paths. So we did have quite a large number of submitters from Mount Albert, those sorts of areas where the airport had been trialling new flight paths, and so that, I guess, triggered a number of submitters to say that the unitary plan should be doing something about these flight paths, but legally the RMA does not allow council control or take into account noise effects from aircraft once they are lawfully airborne. So it's not something the unitary plan could deal with, and it was something that the panel had to advise submitters that they did not have the jurisdiction to control aircraft noise once they're above a certain height. So it has to be dealt with through a separate process. Okay, so that's airports.
In terms of airports and I guess ports, it's almost the assumption is that the transport effects end at the tarmac, and yet if 17 million people go through the airport, a large proportion of they generate numerous transport effects, probably greater than 17 million. Is that kind of recognised at all, or does the airport stop on the tarmac?
No, I think the airport. Well, the airport is subject to all of the other rules in the unitary plan dealing with things like discharging into coastal marine areas and things like that. In terms of development that might generate traffic effects, there's
Traffic effects, yeah.
I don't know if there's specific traffic effects for the airports.
I believe that the Auckland Airport precinct, as part of their development, they have to provide reports in terms of what some of the traffic impacts of the activities will be.
So
I think we're looking at that in a completely, in a complete way in terms of effects, especially in transport. I'm coming back to route protection, of course, and the need that when you get 17 million trips, it doesn't stop, people don't stop at the tarmac. They theoretically could go 360 degrees, but they don't. They go down one or two corridors, essentially.
Okay. Councillor Watson?
Yeah, thank you. Just one question in relation to the aircraft noise overlay. One of the issues that's come up with is in respect of whenuapai, which is quite a different kettle of fish than Mangere, it's a different type of aircraft noise. So does the unitary plan draw a distinction between just straightforward landings and takeoffs, and for instance helicopters doing circuits for 4 hours of the day, or a plane's engine being tested for 3 or 4 hours? Does it get down to that level of distinction, or is it just more landing and taking off?
When an airport such as Whenuapai puts forward its notice of requirements in terms of their operations, that determines the scope of their noise effects. So as part of their designation, they would have had to say how many helicopter flights pass and all of those detailed noise effects as part of that, and that's what is then mapped in the unitary plan. I don't know the exact details of that, but certainly that forms the umbrella of the noise overlay that is contained in the port.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So the last topic under transport and infrastructure and energy is hazardous facilities. So in the notified plan, the regional policy statement referred to managing location of sensitive activities to address risk to human health. For example, risk of emergency events like explosions and so on. District plan provisions in the unitary plan provided for the management of hazardous substances, but they did not manage incompatible uses in close proximity to hazardous facilities. So we're talking things like the Wiri oil terminal, other hazardous facilities, the gas line, and so on, that runs across Auckland. So submitters wanted regionally and nationally important hazardous facility operators, not all submitters, they wanted buffers to protect sensitive land uses from risks of hazardous facilities. so that hazardous facilities were not compromised by conflicting land uses. Council's position at the hearing. So there was an acknowledgement of council that it's not possible for these hazardous facilities to ensure absolutely 100% that in an unforeseen event there isn't some hazard beyond the boundary of the site. And I guess that's what the whole issue comes down to. Should these hazardous facilities be able to manage 100% with all safety precautions in place, all risk, or should there be some recognition in the unitary plan that they can't do that? So council did recognise that it's not possible to internalise emergency events completely within a facility. There are some unforeseen things that can happen even with the best safety procedures in place. So off the back of that, there was a proposal to introduce new provisions to set a framework for what are called emergency management areas for hazardous facilities. Those areas were mapped based on a risk assessment that was undertaken by the council's expert. And this emergency management area was applied to, or was proposed by council to apply around Wiri Oil Terminal and around the Marsden Point refinery to Auckland Pipeline, the RAP, and around liquid gas LPG depot. And specific provisions in relation to Wiri and the liquid gas depot, which required preparation of emergency management plans for development happening adjacent to those facilities, avoiding the establishment of new activities such as childcare centres and dwellings within this emergency management area, and requiring new buildings to be designed to reduce the risk of harm to people through building design. So that's those two hazardous facilities there. Lastly, council's position in terms of the refinery to Auckland Pipeline was to apply a 40 metre either side of the pipeline thin-walled section, so that's not the entire pipeline, that when sensitive activities, i.e. residential or childcare centres, are proposed in that 40 metre buffer area, then notification could be given to Refining New Zealand, and Refining New Zealand would then assess and put forward mitigation proposals for the council to consider as part of that resource consent process. For example, using concrete slabs over the affected part of the pipeline. And that's it on hazardous facilities, and that's the end of the presentation on infrastructure and energy.
Councillor Webster and Councillor Casey.
Yes, just on that last point, refining for the pipeline, how are you going to get over that in rural areas where somebody might put a concrete race or bridge across the top without realising it, because they don't have to go for resource consent?
Everyone knows where the pipeline
I think the preference is for concrete slabs to be used rather than avoided. So
Oh, okay.
that last point is that
Okay,
if
sorry.
you're looking at doing an apartment, a residential building,
Yeah,
then
okay.
you would have to have
Right. Sorry, John, I read it
Yeah.
wrong. Okay, thanks.
Just ask if we had anything defined as a hazardous facility. Does council have anything defined as a hazardous facility?
any of council's
Chamber.
What?
Chamber.
chamber.
Council chambers,
They're
very
explosive.
So we'll have to get back to you on that.
So,
Mr.
you know,
Casey.
our Hazmobile, is that ours?
Yeah.
It's
It's gone.
anymore, unfortunately.
That'll been a long time ago.
Sold it,
Sadly.
very sadly.
It went when we amalgamated
So where does a hazardous go?
Actually,
landfills.
we do. The tank farms down at
Transfer
Wynyard
station.
Quarter
Yeah.
are on
Yeah.
council land,
Space there, a transfer station.
Yeah.
but
No.
not operated or managed by council.
Yeah.
So
But, you know, if you think of water care, places like that, I mean, we would have,
Yeah.
you know, areas for methane processing, we'd have, you know, on our landfill sites and things like that, we'd have
Yeah.
quite a lot of hazardous
Whangarei.
storage. Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Also,
Water care.
places like our city parks, depots, where they would be storing certain chemicals, etc. That would be considered a hazardous facility as well.
Madam Chair, would the port be considered in the same? I mean, there's all sorts of stuff coming in and out.
think we just need to be,
We own the port.
we've got hazardous facilities, but then you have hazardous waste that, or, you know, you have hazardous materials that are stored on facilities that are not classified as hazardous facilities, and I think we're crossing over the two. Like Auckland, North Shore Hospital's not a hazardous facility, but it has
Hazardous
hazardous substances stored on the footprint of that land, and I think we've got separate but related issues to deal with it.
Okay.
Okay, councillor Cashmore.
John, as far as the gas pipeline from the south and the oil pipeline from the north, is the unitary plan future-proofing those for protection as well? For, increasing the size capacity thereof?
Those, the pipeline's already designated, and I understand there is some capacity in that pipeline at the moment.
That's the oil and the gas?
That's the gas pipeline.
Yes.
I'm not sure about the oil one, to be honest. I know the gas pipeline does have capacity.
So you,
I was talking about protecting it for future, Madam Chair, so if there's a designation of a corridor that it travels through, that it's enough to
so
protect.
It
that's,
is
They're
designated.
both designated, yeah.
yep, no, I'm well acquainted with that, because it went through our neighbour's property in Swanson, so, and that's very clearly designated. Everyone knows where the pipeline goes, and I would imagine if it needed to be trebled or quadrupled, that corridor would accommodate that. Any other questions? Nope.
Okay.
Natural hazards.
All right, just welcome Lara Clark, who's one of our lead planner on natural hazards and flooding. All right, so this is a fairly lengthy and technical PowerPoint that we've handed out. So what I propose to do is really just go through the front third of it and see how we go. If there's an appetite for going into a lot more technical detail on specific natural hazards, we can keep on going. Or we can leave you with the presentation and you can come back to us if you have any specific questions after getting through the first part. So just some background. The RMA requires councils to manage risks from natural hazards in things like the unitary plan. There are two main categories of natural hazards. There's the more frequently occurring hazards such as flooding, coastal erosion and land instability. And then there are the other hazards that are less frequent, but they're typically much higher magnitude, for example, volcanic eruptions, tsunami and earthquakes. The objectives and policies in the proposed unitary plan talk about both types of hazards, but the rules in the unitary plan don't deal with volcanoes or tsunami or earthquakes. They really deal with the more frequently occurring things like flooding and coastal erosion, land instability. So in the regional policy statement, there's an approach of not increasing risks to people and property and infrastructure, and that those risks should be reduced wherever possible, and minimising any adverse effects on the environment. There's also reference in the regional policy statement to what's called the natural conveyance function of floodplains and overland flow paths, that they have a very important natural function and that they should be protected from adverse effects of development and infrastructure. That the effects of climate change should be taken into account. They should be considered, looking longer term in terms of hazards. That natural defences and systems should be maintained and where practical enhanced, rather than using hard concrete and steel engineering for things like flooding and coastal erosion, inundation. Requires the scale of and location of activities that are vulnerable to hazards to be managed, and gives effect to the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement in terms of coastal hazards. And the RPS also provides for infrastructure that's functionally and operationally required to be in these hazard areas. It does recognise that infrastructure sometimes is in hazardous areas because there's no other practical option. Also in the notified plan, there was an approach of managing risks from hazards and avoiding creating new risks, and appropriately managing existing risks. That hazards should not be exacerbated through the subdivision or development of land. Identification of hazards and consideration of the 1% AEP event, which is colloquially referred to as the 100-year event. And that was for coastal erosion and flood hazards. Applies a risk-based approach to decision-making, and when we say risk-based approach for hazards, we're talking about what's the type of hazard, what's the probability of it happening, and what's the vulnerability of the activity. Obviously, things like industrial activities are less vulnerable to hazards than residential, possibly. It depends on the specifics. So, requirement for resource consent when subdividing or developing land within hazard areas. Where the submitters were coming from, some were seeking to change the policy approach to provide for more permissive, simplified hazard provisions. Some sought to retain or strengthen the approach to recognise hazards in Auckland, such as flooding and coastal erosion. There was some clarification sought around the types of natural hazards that need to be considered, the spatial areas where the rules apply, and the specific types of resource consent that would apply in the, and also the annual event probability factor, whether it should be 1 in 100 years or 1 in 50 or 1 in 200, and request that natural hazard provisions facilitate provision, maintenance and operation of infrastructure in these hazard areas. So that was coming from the infrastructure providers. Guidance from the hearings panel on hazards. The panel indicated that they agreed that the unitary plan should seek to not increase risks in areas of existing activities and avoid the creation of new risks where there's new development happening. So that was consistent with the council's approach, not increasing where there's existing development, and if there's new development happening, there should be avoidance of creating new risks. Although, however, the panel felt that some of the rules in the unitary plan were starting to double up on the Building Act, particularly in terms of things like flooding controls and floor level.